Everyone. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Working in Tech podcast. This is the show where I bring on experts in the tech industry. And today, our guest actually comes from a political science degree background from Stanford, but he
Yep.
quickly found his way into tech. And he's been a product manager, a data analyst, and co founded multiple ventures. So today, I'm hoping he's going to share his experience and expertise on this podcast and help other people who are looking to transition into the tech industry. Welcome to the show Zach.
Thank you. Thanks, Shawan. Thanks for having me. Excited to chat.
Amazing. So, given your journey into tech, what would you say was the one thing that inspired you, to make that transition into tech?
Honestly, I was probably most inspired from my time at Stanford and just seeing people be so creative. I think that the coolest thing about tech is that it is basically a sandbox. And it's really just a matter of starting and actually just saying, okay, I have an idea or I have something I'd like to contribute or change. So let me just take a shot at it. And then you basically learn usually by a lot of failure and hopefully more successes. So for me, I think that the biggest journey was really just going through and actually deciding that I was able to do it. So breaking your imposter syndrome, breaking this idea that you have to be highly technical or super smart or, highly capable. It's really just those that are willing to actually do it are the ones that actually get it done.
Mm. And I like how you touch on like the different barriers that people face. So can you talk to what your own specific journey looked like and
Yeah.
what some of those challenges were like for you?
Yeah. So it was interesting, right? So when I graduated from college, it was arguably the second tech boom. This is when Snapchat was really popping, Instagram was coming up in a big way. So the second wave of social media was really a big thing. But all the people that were graduating around my time, there was still a lot of like confusion about should we actually take tech seriously as a career. So even at a place, like in Silicon Valley, I had friends that were graduating that were computer science majors or engineers and all these things. And they were like, yeah, I'm not sure about tech. So I had friends that were later or now, let's say, executives at Uber that literally started their career in 2010 working at Walgreens, at CVS, like coming from Ivy League schools. There was so much confusion about where to go. And also, we were in an economic depression. So the way I got into tech was really in a very back channel way. I started out, like you mentioned, poli sci and human biology. I was pre law and pre med. I'm from North Carolina and then also went to high school in Florida. So it was very much like, well, if you're going to go to this good school, are you going to be a doctor or a lawyer? Like I'm sure a lot of
Mm.
people, who are academically perceived to be, gifted are, it's like, what are those two things? Doctor, lawyer, engineer. Are usually the three things if you're, come from an island, oftentimes engineer sprinkled in. But so I was thinking, well, I might as well go be a lawyer. So because I really loved the ability to go and help people in some way. So how can I use systems to change things? How can I use my words and my ability to lead to actually change people? So I actually started off in data science because when I joined my law firm, they were like, "Kid, you're good with numbers, and you should probably do something technical. So even though you're here to get your pre-law experience, why don't you take a look at our numbers and see if you can find fraud here or find things for these insurance companies?" And actually quickly became a data scientist, working on a lot of healthcare fraud, white collar fraud, and financial fraud cases. So I worked on Bernie Madoff litigation. I worked on a lot of the biggest fraud cases that were happening around the 2010s. And I quickly realized that what I was doing was actually tech, even though it was basically going through finding fraud patterns, creating systems to actually pick up on seasonal trends. So we would have, like, let's say a terabyte of data and it's all these insurance claims. We'd be able to figure out, okay, what's more likely to be fraud out of this swath of the data. And then I would create a product to help the insurance companies figure that out. And then the insurance companies say, hey, this kid has a great product. Then the state entities would come and say, hey, can you help us find the fraud? So I realized that it was really just like, data was key. So the biggest foundation that I had in tech was probably coming in as a data scientist, because you're always able to tell stories through data. And even now, like most of what you see now with Web3, with AI, this is just repackaged data science. Everything is data. It's a matter of how you overlay the data and what you're pulling data from, but it's all about data points and telling stories. So I started off there as a data scientist, and then my very first way into traditional tech was actually with my own startup. I had a couple of really good friends who were working at Box, Cisco, and Apple at the time, and they're like, "Hey, Zach, we want to do a startup. Let's just create our own startup." And I was like, "Well, I have a lot of friends that have done that, and I was thinking about maybe going and working at Google or Facebook or doing the traditional path, but I've always been more of a I like to create on my own because I think you have the most opportunity to fail fast, to learn, to really. And it's not so much about quote being a boss. Like I don't think that's really the reason you should ever go into being a founder. It's more about if you feel like you have the chops to really push forward and like you're willing to put your reputation, your name on the line and saying I'm gonna bet on myself. I know that I'll be okay because the thing that's got me this far is my community, my peers, my family, and I'll bet on that over any big company, anything else. So I just wanted to find ways to layer that and stack that up. So I'm like, yeah, let's try being going into tech. So it was interesting, is it was four first time founders, all black men, many of which didn't have any background in traditional tech. So it was definitely we spent about 2 years first laying the groundwork. So okay, what are we going to go into? We decided to create a application called Ticket DM, which was a on-demand exchange application for the music festival community. We were B2B, B2C, and we basically had a way for people to safely exchange items in an on-demand economy. So starting off with physical tickets like RFID tickets, wristbands, things like that. And that turned into all types of items that you need to go to music festivals. Like you go to Burning Man, there are like outfits, there's swag, there's candy, there's all these little trinkets and things that people are exchanging. So we created a platform for that was both B2B and B2B and B2C. And it took us a while to really figure it out, but we had to go through, take the product from 0 to 1, 1 to 10, scale it. We were able to raise funding. We actually had an office in Palo Alto, went through a couple of big accelerators, StartX being one of the main ones, out of Stanford. And after that, I was basically a founder for life in some way, shape, or form. And I fell in love with product. So I think the biggest thing is that when you actually take a product from 0 to 1 and your back's against the wall, that's when you really have to do every single part of it. So doing all the testing, helping the CTO build out the product, doing the wireframe. Sorry, that all came from my time as being a founder, and we were able to basically take our product from 0 to 1, and we had over 200,000 active users in our first 2 years. So we had, we were there.
And what's so interesting about that journey, I know like that's a very short version of the short
Yeah,
version, right?
yeah, yeah,
Is, I have a similar background as a founder, so I can
yeah,
totally relate with a lot of the struggles that you're describing. And
yeah,
I think ultimately not everybody has that opportunity, but I think it's definitely one of the best ways to be a product manager because you get it.
yeah.
So ultimately, was it that experience, working at the law firm, doing data that really kickstarted that, or you felt like it was a mix of other things? And as someone also who's not coming from, a computer science background, right? Which is, again, I don't know about you, but for many people, it's like when you think technology or software, most people would think software development, and that was very closely tied to being a developer or an engineer in some form. So
Yeah.
how did you kind of like decouple that and still kind of like have that belief that you could go do that?
Yeah. So being a product manager is interesting because I think there are really three main components. The first is you have your product set. So do you have an understanding of how products should work, which is kind of a mix of understanding the user journey, understanding UI UX, having a general understanding of your customer segment. So what are you building a product for? Most of that I really got from being a founder because I had to go through and do market research, go through and talk to thousands of beta testers and really understand how do I build a product for a particular customer segment and not for me, not because I think it's going to be really cool or not because it's something that my friends want necessarily, but okay, we have a business objective. We want to test the theory. So how do we test that out? And that leads to my data science background because all I was doing was basically telling stories through data. So when you're a product manager, on top of your product sense, the second thing is your execution, which oftentimes comes from setting up your clear KPIs, your clear OKRs, being able to articulate to a team of stakeholders what does success look like, being able to figure out how this product will scale for, let's say, 5-10 years, theoretically, if it's going to be a large scale product, or if it's like an iterative change, how does that fit into the bigger business model? So I think that the second big thing is execution through data. And the third thing is just like really stakeholder management slash people management. So to go back to your point, I was in a fraternity in college, and a lot of my best friends were all engineers, a lot of the best CS minds I'd ever met in my life. And I was thinking, there's probably no way I'll be able to do what they do, especially in these classes. But what I can do is I'm great at organizing thoughts and organizing uh, a method to the madness. So like there's a lot of raw talent with engineers, a lot of raw talent with technical talent you might have in terms of human resources. But how do you leverage that talent almost like a coach to say, okay, given this person's talents and given what we need to do as a business, how do we put that all together to basically hit our expectations or exceed our expectations? And that's a lot of, human capital, human management, things like that. So I got a lot of that at the law firm, honestly, because I was always doing and managing people people from different offices, people who were just coming in and doing things for a little bit. I'm like, okay, well, you have a skill at this and you're like technical in this way, or you have this, like, let's put it all together to actually create a product roadmap. So I would say those three things were pretty big.
That's amazing. So, just want to shout out everyone who's joining us. Today is actually our 30th episode of the Working in Tech live stream,
Mhm.
and I'm bringing over more of my friends from Twitter and or X as it's called these days, and LinkedIn. So we're actually having a bigger party today.
Nice.
If I know Zach is dropping a lot of gems. Show him some love in the comments. Give this feed a thumbs up, a like, a heart, whatever you got, wherever it's coming to you. And then if you have any questions, feel free to drop them. We won't take questions now, but then we'll get to them later. And Zach is here talking about his journey into product management. I know that's definitely one of the hottest topics, of most people getting into tech in 2024. And I
Yeah.
believe that this is going to be very helpful. So thanks again, Zach, for coming on and sharing your thoughts. So my next question is, how did you transition then from building that startup into like a traditional tech role? Because
Yeah.
those skills are pretty much the same, but
Yeah.
office politics is not,
Yeah.
interviewing is not. Like there's so much more, you
Yeah.
know that even writing a resume, sending a resume, dealing with that frustration. So can you
Yeah.
talk me through like just how you were able to make that transition?
Yeah, so it was actually an interesting transition from being a founder. So there are really two different tracks you can take in tech. It's either you're going in the entrepreneur route or you're going the traditional, basically, IC to manager route. If you're coming in as a founder, it's different because you basically had every single job there is in a startup you probably had in some capacity as a founder. So with Ticket DM, we were lucky enough to scale. We were able to raise, but we were in the events industry during the pandemic. So the tough thing was that around 2020, it was like, well, what's going to happen with events? So we were lucky enough to actually have an acquisition event. We were able to sell our company. But after that, it was basically, okay, well, what am I going to do? I went from being a founder and a CEO. So on paper, was my role ever product manager? Technically, no. But was I the product manager? Definitely yes. For like basically 7+ years. But the issue is like like with the algorithms and what people are picking up. If you're applying the jobs, you're talking to people, we're like, well, Zach, I see you were a founder, but you were never a product manager. I'm like, but I've done that and more. So a lot of it was just figuring out how do you market and brand yourself. And what I had to do was I had to make sure my LinkedIn was right. So I was like, okay, I was a founder, but this under and explaining it, product manager, this is what I did in product. This is what I managed. This is, all the things that I knew they were looking for from a PM standpoint. And then also just doing some soul searching of what type of product manager did I want to be. Because I was a founder, I had a lot of other skills other PMs don't always have. If you're working in traditional tech, a lot of times you come in and you do iterative product change. So you're doing, let's say you're working at Facebook. I'm going to work on Facebook groups and change a certain tab in Facebook groups. If you're a founder, you maybe create all of Facebook, and Facebook groups is one part of it. So you have your pick of a litter of what type of product manager you want to be. And what I realized when I was talking to my friends, they're like, well, we want to talk to you. Why don't you consider doing growth? So what I do now is I do growth product because I realized I was really great at scaling a company and using product as a way to test out new verticals for a company, almost like an entrepreneur in residence would do. That's what I realized my niche was. But there were other opportunities like being a data product manager, being a product manager that's more focused on being a technical product manager if you have engineering background. So product management really doesn't necessarily mean anything in itself, because you're basically working with multiple stakeholders to create a certain outcome with the product, but there's all types of gray area when it comes to what that really means. So product management is tough, right? Because you can't go to school for product management. You can go to boot camps and do things like that, but can you major in it? Not really. It's a mix of lots of hard skills and soft skills, and it's almost like depending on where your slider scales fall, you can figure out, okay, you'd be a good product manager because you have all these things, but what else can you add on to bring your own flavor to it? So the journey was interesting. I went through the process of talking to a couple of great friends who were also founders and brought me in to lead product at their organizations. They were like, you're great at growth. And they started to give me, the other traditional titles, but it took a couple of positions and a couple of years to kind of go to have my resume read, okay, you're a product leader, you're a product person. But even then I wasn't even sure if I was a product person because I was so stuck to being an entrepreneur. But it was definitely interesting for sure. And I realized from a lot of my other friends who went into product that they had similar journeys of like, well, I went into a business, I did this, and I realized I was great with teams and I was great at execution. So I became a product manager. It's almost like you're a mini CEO or you're like a mini entrepreneur. But if you come in already being an entrepreneur, it's honestly it's a pretty easy transition. You just have to make it make sense to the hiring managers and make it make sense to the stakeholders.
It's so interesting that you talk about that journey of being able to explain what you did in the past, because I
Yeah.
have a few friends who have actually gone through that, and
Yeah.
many of them like not wanting to explain, they just change the title from founder to product manager because
Yeah.
it's easier that way. Especially if you're not networking or doing it in person where that person gets it. Oftentimes,
Yeah.
the recruiter is getting that, they're seeing founder, they're thinking, it's not a match and just passing over it, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, there is a match. Like it's one of the many things that I did, so
I
it's
think
definitely
Yeah, I was going
yeah.
to say, I think there are two schools of thought, and I've
Mhm.
heard both be successful. Some people will go and they'll say, I was a product manager, and they'll put that on there on top of other things because it was your own company. You could stack what you did, and it's legitimate, right? But I would almost say that I think that founders do themselves a disservice by just not, you have to say, I was a founder. This is what I do. This is what I did. I'm taking full ownership of this. And you should know that because once you come in as a founder, and you're a product person, you'll have an accelerated pathway oftentimes to C-suite to other things because they know that you have those other chops. So never
Mhm.
make yourself small for what the business requires. You need to do a great job of explaining what you do, but at the end of the day, you need to be with the right business that understands your full skill set to put you in the best position. Never be in a situation where
Absolutely.
you're going backwards. If you're a founder, keep moving forward. Hey, I was a founder for my company, and I'm going to jump into the Series B company and above and really crush it. But I'm starting where I left off. I'm not going backwards to fit your narrative just because they're going to figure it out. Like you're going to go to your first meeting, they're going to be like, you seem like you're almost overqualified. Like it's going to come out, and it's going to be like confusing. So it's important to make sure that you talk your talk. Like you need to make sure you don't forget who you are.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's definitely great advice. So,
Yeah.
one of the things that I hear is, how crucial networking is.
Yep.
Um, you know, you've been a member of StartX for quite a while. How has community influenced your career?
Yeah. Oh man, I think community is the best thing that you can do it, particularly if you're a young person in tech. I think I was so behind with being intentional with networking. And I know they don't really tell you how to do that. There's a lot of confusion of like, how do I network? How do I talk to people? Do I make it really businessy? And I would say not, you don't really have to make it super businessy. You can just talk about what you care about and the things that you're looking for with, whatever network you're part of. And usually you'll naturally fall into the groups, the friend groups, the people that you need to talk to. And oftentimes the initiatives and the companies that they're working on because they know what you care about. So just being yourself and saying, I care about these things, I socially am doing these things, can take you a long way. But for me, I think StartX was definitely the best thing to happen to me in terms of professional network because you're with a ton of founders who are, super hungry, super passionate, and just there to build. It's not a lot of bells and whistles. It wasn't a lot of, I want to be famous or being a founder. Now being in tech is like the cool, sexy thing. So you oftentimes have to differentiate between people who are organically there to build because they want to build product, they want to build network, they want to build business versus, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like if you want to get a great job, go and get a great job. But you have to know what lane you fall in to make sure you're with the right crowd of people because people have different interests, right? Some accelerators or some professional networks are like a lot of people who want to be more on the hype beast side. It's like I want to get there to kind of I want the attention, and that's okay because like you need people that are like that as well. But I think for StartX, it was very much like this like a super organic, amazingly supportive network. And I just was lucky enough to fall into other similar networks. A good friend of mine started a network called Next Play Events, which was a diversity and tech based group where there are a ton of people who are, Black, brown engineers, Black, brown product managers, people who are all basically looking for their board of advisors, their personal mentors, like who's going to be my sponsor, my advocate. And there are certain challenges you have, let's say as a person of color, an immigrant, a first generation professional. Finding like those networks is also super crucial for me as well. So the mix of StartX plus that really changed my life and put me in position for almost everything that I do now.
That's amazing. So, if you could pick three skills, right,
Yeah.
that have served you maybe from your entrepreneurship days, but most especially, as a product manager, what would
Yeah.
those three skills be?
I'd say, let's see. So the first is making defensible decisions. So you have to create a rubric for why you are doing what you're doing. So people have to understand it's not so much about being successful. It's like, let me understand what you're doing when I'm not focused on you. So if you are a product manager and you have a manager and you have stakeholders, they have to fully understand why it is that you made your decisions and what data or metrics or rubrics you're using to defend those decisions. So that even if we're successful, we understand why. And if we're not successful, we understand why we were not successful. Because the worst thing in product is to waste time. The biggest thing that a product manager is oftentimes doing is we have a limited amount of resources, a limited amount of time, and we need to hit these goals. So if we're going to be doing something, why do we do it? So that if it is successful, we can repeat it. And if not, we don't do it again. So I think that's probably one of the biggest ones for me for sure. The second one is I think leading from behind. So really understanding your various stakeholders and also your team members. Most product managers are working with UI, UX people, obviously engineers, sometimes an engineering manager who's basically in between engineers and product managers. So understanding how your team works, what everyone's strengths and weaknesses are, and also, what their backlog is. If you're coming in as a new product manager, you can't just say, okay, I'm new, I'm going to come and take over everything, because people have lived and breathed usually whatever product they're building, whatever tasks they're trying to tackle. So take time to really understand what's happened before you, so you can then integrate it into your obviously thinking going forward, but also you understand the people that you're working with to more adequately address the problem in real time. So I think leading from behind is very important. And then just I think being an advocate. So you have to have the confidence and the ability to articulate what's going on from your group. Like your team will look for you to be the talking point usually for C-suite, for stakeholders, for the entire engineering group that you're managing, all the UI UX designers, all the project managers, everybody that's with you in that project. Oftentimes the PM is the person that needs to be the speaker. You need to be the communicator. You need to be clear and thorough and concise. So that's a big thing. And that also means as a PM being direct. So if somebody is going off kilter or there's an inefficiency, you are ultimately accountable for that. It's not on C-suite. It's not on the business. It's not even on the engineers, or it's on you to figure out, hey, we had 2 weeks to hit this mark. If you didn't hit that mark, what happened? So again, being able to explain yourself. It's a lot if you had siblings growing up or had little cousins where you had to be like, all right, we just did all this stuff, outside. I can explain why, my little cousin's arm is scraped up, but you have to just explain it to the stakeholders, right? And I definitely got that growing up being the oldest. So I think that probably primed me a lot for being a product manager later.
I want to zoom in a little bit on that last piece, because I think what you're kind of like talking about is communication.
Yeah.
And that can be like a very important skill. Um, Again, almost like, as a product manager, you're directing traffic for the most part, right?
Yeah.
Which means that you're communicating to different audiences. How important is it to be able to first of all, understand the context in which you're communicating, even if it's the same content,
Yeah.
and being able to speak to those different individuals or personalities in the way that's most effective.
Yeah, I think that empathy is really important for a PM. A lot of it is soft skills, so you have to understand your team's motivations, on top of all the business stuff. The business stuff is obviously super important, but if you don't understand what makes people tick and what makes them most motivated, you're oftentimes not going to be in the best position to filter through the various channels. You're filtering what you might hear from your engineers, from your engineering manager, from your team to your manager or to C-suite, and you're filtering their information back to your team as well, while simultaneously defending what you understand their purpose to be outside of maybe what comes up on paper. So on paper, it might just be directive. Make sure that we hit these marks in 4 weeks. We need to have these 4 features. But that's a cold directive. The warm directive is the reason we have these 4 features is because we have this business idea in mind. And one person that's on the C-suite team really loves this idea because it's personal to him or her. And there's somebody on the engineering team that's really great at doing that type of thing, as they've had a lot of experience doing it in the past. So you have to really take time to understand your team, and be able to articulate everyone's wants and interests to each other in a way that is more empathetic and more in their own language. It's like being, having a friend group and everyone is slightly different, but you're the person in the middle that can talk to everybody, and everybody like kind of filters it through you. That's oftentimes what you're doing as a PM. Because if not, you can have a lot of very talented, incredibly smart people running terrible organizations by lack of communication. Just like any relationship, you might be the two most wonderful people in the world, but together you're terrible because of your communication. So it's really a big thing for sure.
That is so powerful. And something I want to kind of like say last, or maybe get your thoughts on before we move on is, I think at the top I talked about the politics. And I, for one, moving into corporate America was very shocked by it, right? Because I didn't expect there to be so much like red tape and like, how people even communicate things,
Yeah.
not wanting to be direct, not wanting to ruffle feathers. And that can be a good thing because I think it means that in large organizations, like people are able to more easily get along. But I
Yeah.
also see that it can be problematic, right? In the sense that, like, oftentimes people don't really say what they mean.
Yeah.
And I think in product, especially if you've been an entrepreneur, like, oftentimes I think, especially for early stage startup founders, you're oftentimes between like 6 to 18 months of your company dying, right?
Yeah.
At any given point. So you really, really have to be clear. You have to be concise. You have to be precise regarding whatever the problem is at any given point.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like it becomes a big challenging, not being able to oftentimes say what you mean very directly and very. So is that something
Yeah.
that you've encountered, and how have you navigated that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a delicate balance, particularly as a product manager, because you are holding the narratives of your team as well as your own narrative at the same time. And your job is to tell the story. So when you tell the story, everyone's looking at you to see how you factor in every single person's thought process to make sure they're all happy, and also make sure you're looking out for your career progression at the same time. I think that for most PMs, I would advise just being really great again at having rubrics, having things to explain your decision making, and then go in and do your own like time to reflect and think about, okay, for the next 12 months, what are my individual goals with the company, and what do I see in the purview of the work that I have of ways that I could really show and prove value for the company, and then focus on telling that story over time, not to like go off directive or anything like that, but make sure you have some intentionality, because no one's going to come and save you as a PM. That's the weird thing. Like, you might have a manager, but oftentimes they're looking for you to be the person that's going to be their secret weapon. So you're not going to be coddled. You don't have, I mean, you might find other PMs to talk to, other founders to talk to, but you need to definitely know that you're in it. You're a director. Like, it's almost like you're putting out a movie. You will be held accountable to how the movie does overall, right? So make sure that you tell a good story, and that comes from like making sure you have good data, and make sure you're listening to people around you so that you don't lose their narratives and what you need to tell for the story overall. Because ultimately, if everyone is pulling their weight and everyone feels like they're heard, usually it's a positive outcome in some way. It doesn't mean the company will always be super successful, but your position in the company will be successful and you'll be able to keep growing from there. So I would definitely say, take ownership, take lead. Don't be afraid. Like this whole thing, you have to be afraid of corporate. Everyone's just like, once you've been a founder, you realize that there's no difference between you and them at all. So that's the biggest myth in tech. Like, oh, they're there for a reason. They are for sure. People earn their positions, but there's not much, but that's a decision away. You can just go and start your own company. You'll be there in a couple of years too. So don't be afraid to go and be the leader, because as you get more and more experience, it can only go up from there. There's no going down. No one's gonna be like, oh, you were too honest and articulate and driven, and I was really upset by that. You might ruffle some feathers as people are thinking like, damn, this person is really good. But those are good ruffles. Like that's respect. That's not ruffling feathers. Like, so don't misconstrue respect with ruffling feathers. Not, it's important to get that.
Great, great, great. So I know a lot of people in the audience are gonna love this one. So what's the typical career salary progression that you've seen for product managers? So for people who
Yeah.
are starting out early, people who are kind of like mid-career, and
Yeah.
top of the funnel, like what's possible?
Yeah. So it depends on where you're coming from. If you work in tech traditionally, most people will start out either as an engineer or an engineering manager. Um, or they'll be a project manager. So that those are usually the two ways that people will break in. And then they ultimately, over time, somebody will say, hey, engineer, you have a great knack for product generally. You do a great job with managing other engineers and articulating and communicating. You should consider being a product manager. That's usually how most people will come in, or they're a founder. So I missed that. I would say project manager, founder, or engineer are usually the three most common ways people come in as product managers. We have a lot of people also coming in from like business school. So if you went to business school and you are great at articulating business cases and using numbers and doing that, some people will go and make that transition as well. I would say that if you are someone who's starting off new, a lot of people will go through boot camps. There are a lot of great boot camps now for product management. It's not as easy as some of the other career tracks though, because you can't really teach it as simply. You can get opportunities to lead product and to do things. So the easiest way to do it is to get out and do it. So I would say you want to just join a tech company, particularly a startup if you can, and get a PM role in your first year or two just by talking to C-suite. So if you're somebody who's coming in, doesn't have a lot of experience, I would say either join a startup without the boot camp, or if you want to do a boot camp, pick any career path and then just say, I have an interest in product, and then allow that to marinate for a year or so. And oftentimes, if you're great with the company, they'll allow somebody who's ambitious and who seems to be great with the people and great with business to give it a shot at being a PM. So those are the two most common ways that I see people breaking into product management now.
Great, great, great. That's a nice segue into kind of like my next question, or maybe a part two,
Mhm.
is for someone who's completely new, what are some of the kind of like building blocks, if you like, right? So for example, I think you kind of like touch on it indirectly, but I want you to call it out a bit more directly. So let's say
Mhm.
you're a PM hiring manager, and
Mhm.
this person doesn't have any prior PM experience as a product manager.
Yep.
What are some things that you'll be looking for that can get them over the bar?
I would look for their ability to tell stories with data and tell stories with their involvement in a team. So again, when you're working in any project, let's say for in any capacity, you have a part to play in that project. So can you, as somebody who is a potential PM, articulate what everyone's role was in that project, what you did, what success looked like, and how you got to that point, and particularly how you contributed to that process? A lot of it is just being awake and aware, honestly, and being able to really understand what's happening. A lot of times people are just working almost as white noise, or working as I'm going to do my one little part, but no one's looking at it from a 30,000-foot view or seeing what everyone's doing and how they all work together. So I think that a lot of times the way people are able to differentiate themselves is to be able to tell a compelling story that makes sense and that's defensible. And you can do
Mhm.
that really from any position, tech or non-tech. I've seen people come in from all walks of life and say, "Hey, I've never worked in tech, but I think I'd be a great product manager, particularly with startups. And here's why." And I've seen that transition happening, literally going from no experience to being a PM. So it's definitely possible. It's less likely for big tech companies, as there's so many PMs that they can hire. But for
Actual PMs.
yeah, but for startups or for like you definitely have an opportunity. And some of those startups are just as competitive financially, just as competitive in terms of what they're building. There's a lot of opportunity there. So I mean, I'm obviously slightly biased as a lifetime startup person, but I think that it's definitely a good track to consider.
Great, great, great. That's amazing. And in terms of like earning potential, right? Your salary, what do you
Yeah.
think is kind of like someone can expect as a kind of like start out in tech and move up in product and move across the
Yeah. Yeah. So the cool thing about tech is that the salaries oftentimes have gotten pretty awesome for a lot of people if you're able to get them. So most people that I see, even if you're coming out of college as a PM or you're coming in as your first time PM role, you can expect at the low bar somewhere around 130K, which is like a good start because you're coming right in as a junior PM. Most people after about 5 years of being a PM, you're looking at around at least 200, 2 to 300 pretty soon because you're going to be looked at as if you're a senior PM, you're very vital to the company. You're almost like a mini CEO. And then after that, there's a very obvious track to being C-suite or being a director. And then you're talking about like much bigger, you're talking about 300,000 plus salaries plus equity. So that's when you really, have your potential to make it, to have your generational wealth type opportunity. So PM roles are one of the fastest tracks to getting to that, especially with startups. Other roles are not as easy because outside of the founders are not going to give those people as much responsibility. But PMs are oftentimes expected to have a lot of responsibility, which comes with a lot of equity and a lot of oftentimes salary. So that's usually what you can expect.
so, you've seen like the different parts of tech, different sides of tech, all of the new technology. I think you talked about it.
Yeah.
What excites you the most right now, just in tech in general?
Let's see, where do I start? I would probably say just the evolution of data. As a data scientist, there are two really cool things that are happening right now. The first is like the no code solution. The fact that now as an engineer, you literally don't necessarily have to code. You are using oftentimes whatever your native language is and using language models to articulate concepts, articulate, the most human elements to a computer that can do a lot of the coding for you, or at least create the backdrop. And that's only getting more and more advanced over time. So I think that the opportunity to create amazing products is mind-boggling because now you don't have that technical limitation. And now we're also a much more international, you know, tech is international now, so you don't even have to have the same access to, let's say, quote unquote, like American or European, like the biggest schools, institutions, or the biggest startups. You could just be anyone, anywhere in the world, and literally say, "I want to build these things," and you have like the skeleton, and you add the skeleton. You like say that multiple times. You can create your own startup and thing without having any technical background or experience. I think that's really amazing. The second thing I would say is also just like the advancement of Web3, particularly when it comes to AI. It's really just data science. I think everything comes back to just being data and data layers, but we're moving into like new layers of data. So you have visual data, you have historical data when it comes to people's behavior. So how do you put together all these data models to create something new and to really create awesome things for whatever target group you're building for? So I would say definitely making sure you have a data background, and making sure you don't skip steps. Like it's very easy to say, okay, I have things like chat GPT and other Web3 models. I'm just going to like ask it for this and not really understand it, but ask it for it and then go back and look at what it created and why. Like you can look in the back end of how whatever your prompt was, like actually how it got there. Start to understand data in a really compelling way, and you have a lot of opportunity to build things in a really interesting way going forward, I would say.
I think what blows my mind about your answer is that, while you talk in technology, I think it's the human angle. So even like, people's ability to manipulate systems without learning how to code, people being able to kind of like transcend technology across different geographies and not be worried about like all of the talent being concentrated, or even the know-how being concentrated in the same place, and even the second answer the same way. That's definitely very interesting. So I think we're coming to the point where we're taking questions. So, hey, if you have any questions, leave them in the chat. We're going to start taking them, and drop likes, drop all of the fire emojis. I think Zach is doing an amazing job breaking this role down. I don't think I could do it any better. Thanks for sharing your knowledge again.
Thank you.
So the first question that we have is from Janine, and she's asking, what exactly does a product manager do day to day?
Yeah. So sorry, this is a dog is jumping in. So day to day, a product manager.
That's the co guest.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, PMs are usually doing like three things. The first is that it's probably about a third of your time is going to be with stakeholder management, and that can be with meetings, with Asana or task trackers, with things like Slack. So, what's the status of this? Am I keeping all of my stakeholders happy, and am I communicating? It's very easy to just like if you fall out of communication with people, then your job as a PM is going to be way, way more difficult. So, just checking in, following up, talking to people is one third of the job. The other third is going to be making sure your data metrics are up to date. So if you do have KPIs or tools like, let's say you're using like Amplitude or Tableau or Looker or whatever, how do I create visual representations for stakeholders and for team members of what we're doing, what the progress is, or how close we are to hitting goals, where they don't have to ask me every day or every second about where it is. They can just go and see it and also put in their part so they don't feel like you are basically being a bottleneck. Like you need to make sure as a PM that communication is flowing both ways and that they don't have to go, they can go through you, but they go through your systems, not through you directly. Because if they go through you directly, sometimes the human element will create a problem. So make sure that you're, as a product manager, you created a product for your company that runs with or without you. That's really a lot of what your job is, and making sure that all those KPIs are there and everything is clear. The third is just like taking time to create. So you need to make sure you leave enough of your time to be open to thinking, okay, we need to think of creative solutions for these business needs, these product needs, and how am I going to creatively pull together certain pieces to make this happen, where I'm going to continue to add value in a way where I'm not falling behind. So you need to be leading forward with creativity and also leading forward with data and with metrics. So I'd say those are the three things that a product manager does day to day.
That is amazing. Lead with creativity, and you know, guide your decision making with data and metrics. That's so cool. So your careers, another question, your career seems to involve a lot of data analysis. As someone who's not great at math, should I be worried about getting into tech?
Yeah. So the cool thing about tech is that we have systems that do math for us. Most people are not. You'd be shocked at how bad at math a lot of engineers are. A lot of it's really about having the guts to go through the process of failing and failing and failing again, and just getting better at it. So it's not like you have to go and run calculations in real time. You'll see if things are right or wrong, as you have a team for that. You have systems and processes for that. It's a matter of like actually not getting afraid of the numbers or getting afraid of it to the point where you can't articulate a story or you can't make it make sense. Like you have to get a handle on it just by like taking the time to breathe and be like, okay, this is scary. This kind of sucks, or I'm not good at this, but I'm going to figure out how I would articulate it to myself or to people like me. And oftentimes the common denominator is the best way to articulate it to the company. So the fact that like I wasn't the best person in math, my friends are world scholar level mathematicians oftentimes in school. I took the lowest level math possible when I got to college because everyone was so good at math. And I was coming from a Florida school system. No shade, love Florida in certain ways, but I was not going to be the same as people who are coming in from all over the world with the best math minds of all time. But what I realized is that I was really good at telling stories through math to people that were like me. And weirdly enough, I'm perceived to be like this great numbers person, but to my friends, I wasn't. But they understood I was great at storytelling, and it made sense. It was like, oh, this is right, this is accurate, but it's not necessarily how I would have said it. But I actually don't have that skill that you have to articulate it. So I would say, definitely don't be afraid. Math is not a limiting factor. It really isn't.
And you touch on something that I think is important because numbers don't make sense in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
In fact, I think something that's shocking is that, a natural disaster could happen in a place and they mention like, this many people were impacted, or let's not even talk natural disasters. Let's talk like layoffs, right?
Yeah.
it says 11,000 people lost their jobs, right? People don't always have like the best reference for what 11,000 people losing
Yeah,
their jobs mean. You see what I'm saying?
exactly. Yep.
But someone writing a very emotional LinkedIn post about, how losing this role now means that they have to find another role in like 60 days or leave the company or leave the country, and how this is going to impact their families, friends, is going to likely have a bigger impact than that one post that says, this faceless, nameless people that I don't know the impact of as lost their jobs, right? So
Yep.
I think what you say is completely very crucial. It's being able to bring that external perspective into the conversation and add, something that helps drive home the impact, not just the numbers. And I think the second bit of that is also even the fact that, I think with a lot of the technologies that you talk about, even technology companies are realizing that to be able to bring more people in, they have to kind of like solve that technology problem. So, for
Yep.
example, I was at a conference recently where the Angular team is, simplifying their syntax just to make it more writable and readable for people who are just new to it, just making it more simpler for people to be able to write code. And you're getting all this co-pilot features and all these different things. It's not great right now, but ultimately, I think even the need to do all of that, because oftentimes that can even get in the way of the work. But I
Yep.
think being able to still have that courage, I think what you said is so powerful. If you also develop that, not necessarily lack of fear, but just courage to deal with it regardless, I think it might even work out where technology gets easier, but also you're more prepared to kind of like meet that opportunity.
Yeah.
So going to the next question from Jason. So how did you learn to understand all of the industry specific language at Jargon in your role?
Yeah, it's interesting. I learned a lot of it, honestly, from going through my professional networks and going through accelerators. You have to talk to other people who have the job because they'll start to use the terms, and you'd be surprised at how limiting your career could be just by using the wrong terms. It's so dumb when you think about it, to be honest, but it's so real. Like when I was a data scientist and I would interview junior data scientists, and they would say, "Hey Zach, I'm really good at SQL and stuff." And I would like, everyone says SQL. Now, obviously, that doesn't really matter. It says SQL, right? But if you don't say SQL on the interview, you're going to be discounted immediately over something so ridiculously stupid. But it shows that you've been around people and you've talked to people enough to really understand what that means. So I think the best thing you can do, if you don't already have your network, go to YouTube and just listen to mock interviews of, let's say, PMs or mock interviews of whatever, and just like start to write down the terms they use and look them up and look up from multiple websites and like compare the definitions and add them. Create a Google Doc saying these are the terms I'm hearing all the time, so that when you do interview, you can start to, within reason, sprinkle in some of those terms, and that's when you're showing signal that you understand what you're talking about. And it's a very political, gatekeepy type of situation, especially if you're breaking into a big company. But that's what you have to do, and it matters a lot. So you have to definitely study if you're trying to break into tech. Spend time studying as though you were studying for the SAT, studying for a test. Like take a couple of hours and just like understand terms, because those terms are going to come up. They're going to drop. Somebody will just say in a job interview, "What's like this, and this?" Or like, "Do you understand what this means?" You're going to be like, "Can you define that?" When depending on how you ask that, the interview might write you off. Just the fact that you even asked to define it, and I know they shouldn't, but they do. So you have to really take time to become a student of the language that you're trying to understand. And product managers, there really isn't a ton. Luckily, it's not. It is technical, but it's not so wildly technical. Most of it is engineering things that you'll learn from your engineers. So if you have friends that are engineers, talk to them and see, "Hey, what are you building? Hey, what's your tech stack? Tell me more about what that means." Like a lot of times for PMs, you have to just understand those basic things.
I think, yeah, spot on again. And I think that's so important because I remember even like my journey as an entrepreneur, I was set up with this investor meeting and it was something similar. Like it wasn't even like an interview, right? But ultimately, it's like, when an interview comes, I think it gives a lot more confidence, when I was communicating all the right things, but I was
Yeah,
just saying it in such a layman term that it just felt like, there's still a lot more to be done in your professional development. I think that's
yeah,
kind of like the vibe I got, right? So, and that's so key because ultimately, I think, if you want to get the roles, you want to be respected in the profession the professional in that profession, I think it's kind of like, table stakes, to be
Yep.
honest. Like, you have to be able to speak in the language. You have to be able to be comfortable, around the people who speak there and be able to kind of like pick up the lingo. So yeah, that's definitely a great way to do it. Again, what he said is watch a lot of mock interviews and talk to people who are in the role and pick up and do a lot of research. I think that part is most key, because I think a lot of people are always watching out for, can somebody tell me? No, you have to do that. You might get that initial part, but you have to do that last mile of really immersing yourself in the concepts.
Yep.
And Maxine is asking, is a growth product manager's job any different from a regular product manager?
Yeah. So growth PMs are more beholden to the business stakes, and depending on where the company is in maturity, they're either focused on getting growth to get product market fit, or hitting growth for certain business objectives outlined by investors. So it's like, hey Zach, we have to hit 1 million users with a monthly active at this rate with these points. How do we get to that point, and how are our metrics tracking to get there? But also, what test or what little A/B test or tweaks to the product do you think that we can consider based on your understanding of the data to get to that point? So we're trying to make the numbers make sense. A growth PM's role is very much focused on data science and some level of marketing. Oftentimes, you're doing acquisition or transactions or things like that. So you're working a lot with the marketing team as well, or whoever is doing the user journey. A lot of times you're working with them as well. So it's really more of a data driven based role, versus a traditional PM might just be make this work. And do we have greater than zero adoption? Basically, can people use this? But a growth PM is going to be like, okay, we've gotten that to that point, but can we scale this? So growth PMs are oftentimes very focused on scalability. So you're the next step beyond oftentimes the PM. Not to I obviously am a little bit biased as a growth PM, but a lot of times you're right there. So you're working a lot of times with PMs across the board who are kind of taking care of the day to day, and you are the entrepreneur in residence. You're the risk taker. You're the data miner. You're the person that gets us to the next level oftentimes, or you're the person who's going to take the risk to figure it out. So that's how it's different.
And I have a personal follow up to that, because what you just described sounds like a moving target, right?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, like you're worrying about marketing. Are you, for example, fully optimizing your channels, right?
Yeah.
On another side, it could be like, is your messaging everyone right to get more people into the funnel? And like, are you converting at every level?
Yep.
And in some other places, it's like, are we getting enough transactions? Are we even keeping the people happy? Because again, you don't just want to acquire, you just also want to retain. So
Yep.
across that whole value chain, as a growth PM, and I know it will differ, right? But where, just from your own kind of like experience, is the biggest, or where do you always see like kind of like the biggest gains?
The biggest gain in terms of how the growth PM can change things, or the
No,
biggest gain for the company?
no, biggest gain on how, like, so for example, is it usually like in the marketing funnel, or is it kind of like in
Got it.
the user experience, or maybe even cutting
Got it.
down the journeys, right?
Got it. Yeah. So we're usually most focused on customer acquisition and transactions. So if you're or subscriptions, or whatever, where's the money coming from, and how are we making that money make sense? And if you're more of like a B2C or social, it's like, well, how are our numbers doing, and what's the actual lifetime value, let's say, of somebody who's part of your conversion funnel. So we're focused on value long term, and that's the difference.
Yeah, amazing. That's great. I don't know that we have any more questions, but I think we're coming up on the hour. This is usually the part where if you want to shout out anyone, you want to promote anything, this is
Yeah.
usually the spot. Or if you just want to say maybe one final word of wisdom to the audience, this is
Yeah.
also
I would say the best wisdom I would give is to find your tribe, find your community, find people that are like-minded, who are building things, who are interviewing, who want to do things that are similar, because that will be your network for the next 10, 20 years. My lateral network is how I've gotten almost everywhere I am. It's like people are right next to me. So people who are your coworkers now are going to be the people who refer you later for your job. So care about your relationships, but also be very intentional with networking. One of the things that I do now is that I have a venture called Cafe Cultura, which is focused on really anybody can join, but it's focused in South Florida primarily, even though we're national. And we support, diverse entrepreneurs and people who are trying to break into tech, either through getting jobs directly or tech boot camps, whatever you want to do. We talk about that at Cafe Cultura. So we have a lot of events coming up this year in Miami and San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles. I'd also shout out organizations like Next Play Events. They're amazing. They're national as well. They, great, amazing events with art and music and food, and you just go and talk to other people who are interested in tech and network like crazy. So I'd recommend finding your network, and if not, start one. Be intentional for sure.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Zach. This has been an amazing working in tech live stream episode. And if this is your first time here, definitely go check out all the other great episodes that we've had on this channel. We've been away for the whole of June, and today is the first day back, 30th episode, and we have it back to back. So join us again at 6 p.m. Central Time, 7 p.m. Eastern for another amazing working in tech live stream. Thank you so much, Zach. This has been so powerful. Thanks for sharing your experience in product, and we'll see you again soon.
All right, guys, thank you so much.